Welcome to the Unit 2 lecture entitled Identifying Moral Temptations or Wrongs. The questions that we're going to answer in this lecture are: how do you gather relevant facts about what is wrong in the workplace? What are wrongs? How do you define them? And what do we know about misconduct in the workplace? If you remember in Unit 1, we covered ethical sensitivity. That is the ability to see that you are facing a moral or ethical issue and why developing it is so critical and yet so difficult. Now we move on to the next steps in ethical decision making according to Kidder, which is to gather the relevant facts in order to determine if you are facing a moral temptation, which is a temptation to do a wrong, or an ethical dilemma, which is having to choose between two rights. In this unit, we'll focus on gathering relevant facts and identifying wrongs. In Unit 3, we will get into identifying ethical dilemmas. To gather the relevant facts, you must first understand the issue or act itself, as well as the issue or act within context. Now remember, this is not saying that ethics are relative or that ethical relativism exists. However, it does say that because professional standards differ from context to context, and the law is different from context to context, there might be some wrongs that you will find within a particular context that you wouldn't find within another context. That does not mean that it's not an ethical issue. But with professional ethics or personal ethics at work, you need to find out, is this act wrong? And one of the ways to do that is to check out statements from the particular context. Statements like value statements, organizational codes of conduct, professional standards, or laws and regulations. What are value statements? Well, value statements are typically put out by organizations, sometimes by professions, and they state the most important or primary values of that organization or profession. The UC Statement of Ethical Values is one type of example, and there are also many professional association examples as well. These statements are going to choose some of the core values that we looked at last week. For example, the UC Statement of Ethical Values does talk about integrity and accountability and respect. The value statements are widely posted and distributed along with mission and vision statements in organizations. Why are these statements of values important? Well, it can help employees prioritize and make decisions. If I'm having to choose between honesty and loyalty, which we'll see more about in Unit 3, I could go to these value statements to see, does the organization profession value honesty or do they value loyalty? And if they only list one, that might help me prioritize in that particular situation. It can enhance the ethical dialogue because people will talk about values that are at play rather than just saying, this feels wrong. They could say this feels wrong because it's dishonest, and our value statement for our company talks about honesty as a core value. It certainly announces intent by the company or the profession. We intend for our members to act honestly. We intend for our members to act with respect. We intend to act with respect. And sometimes voicing that intent can help us stick with those values even when it's difficult. They also help everyone to get on the same page. Remember, we talked about last week how organizations and society are diverse. So in order to get everyone on the same page, these statements of values can do that. They can say, hey, we all come from different places, but we all recognize these 4 or 5 values are the most important values to our organization. And finally, they can serve as reminders when pressure to cheat or engage in misconduct may loom large. For example, the ICAI's fundamental values, which you looked at last week, which is a fairly long statement of values, serves as a reminder to all educational organizations and their stakeholders, like students and faculty, about what's important within the academy. Now, there's also codes of ethics. Sometimes these are separate from value statements, sometimes they're one and the same. But a code of ethics is an ethical code that is a statement of aspirations and a commitment to stakeholders. It should describe standards that go beyond the law, which, as we talked about last week, is the bare minimum, in order to cover the highest ideals that we want to see amongst our people. Codes of ethics legitimate organization values and may help provide guidance. So the statement of values really is just a statement of values. Honesty, what does that mean? Respect, what does that mean? But the code of ethics then kind of operationalizes these values and legitimizes them by saying, hey, we're so serious about honesty that we have these rules in order to uphold honesty. And those rules help provide guidance for people's behavior. Codes of ethics are usually an attempt by an organization or a profession to answer the question, what is right? And according to the National Business Ethics Surveys, at least 82% of companies have codes or written standards for ethical conduct. So they are quite common, and they have been quite common since the 90s and more particularly the early 2000s after an eruption of a bunch of corporate scandals. According to Kidder, there's 4 characteristics of a good code of ethics. It should be brief but memorable, and at least in part it should be easy to memorize. It should raise standards without a lot of explanation. It can include positive or should include positive and negative language. In other words, positive is this is what respect is, and then the negative language is if you don't respect, this is what will happen to you. And it should center on moral values. We may debate some of these, particularly the standards without explanation piece. But it's something to consider that these are 4 at least fundamental characteristics of a good code of ethics. In this class we're going to combine, well, we have our code of ethics in the syllabus, and your team code of ethics are both going to combine statements of values and the code of ethics kind of standards for how one might behave according to those values. So we're going to merge value statements and code of ethics together. So why are codes of ethics important? Well, like value statements, they serve as reminders and standards of behavior. For example, the policy on integrity of scholarship is a reminder to students about the importance of integrity when they're doing their academic work. And when there's an absence of a written code, it says that the organization has no coherent sense of what their ethical core is. It may also send a signal that the organization or profession doesn't care about ethical behavior, that they just want the job done and they don't care. They care about instrumental or political or economic values, but they don't particularly care about ethical values. But if they have a code of ethics or a value statement, that shows, hey, we care about this. As we mentioned earlier with value statements, it helps everyone be on the same page. Usually codes of ethics also provide procedures for responding to misconduct, and they make the consequences clear so that it can help to create a sense of a fair system or process for dealing with misconduct. And that's extremely important because fairness is one of our most important core values, and if the process for resolving allegations of misconduct aren't fair, then it's hard for the organization to ask their members to act fairly. The problem with codes is they cannot cover all ethical situations. And so what happens is that people tend to depend on codes too much so that they will look at it, and if the code doesn't say don't do this or doesn't say that, then they'll do it and say, well, I thought it'd be okay. So as we mentioned last week, just because something is legal or something is okay according to a code of ethics or not mentioned in a code of ethics doesn't mean that it's ethical. Okay? So that's very important to remember. Some researchers like Bazerman and Tenbunzel also note that the other problem with codes is sometimes they can backfire. The act of asking people to comply can sometimes means that they comply even less. And we'll talk more about that later. So let's look at, usually what happens is there's a law, and that is usually, unfortunately, the basis for a lot of times, especially organizational codes of ethics, especially in the world of business. they've developed these because Sarbanes-Oxley required them to, or there's just legal or regulatory standards that require them to codify these into code of ethics. Professional codes of ethics are usually based more on their core fundamental values. For example, the engineering code of ethics really are focused on public safety. Healthcare professionals' code of ethics are really based fundamentally in the health of patients. But they all are going to also stem from the law and what they're legally required to ensure their employees and members do. And then oftentimes, an organization will have a code of ethics, and then a team or unit within that organization can have a code of ethics. And that's what we're doing in this class as well, although we are not really basing ours on the law. So that's how, when you're in an organization or a profession, you can begin to gather facts about what's going on in this situation. Is there anything about the situation that suggests it might be wrong? Am I facing a moral temptation to do a wrong that is clearly prohibited within my context? Something else that can be helpful in identifying whether you're facing a moral temptation or wrong is Kidder's suggestion that there's 3 ways to be wrong. So, of course, one of them is violation of law, regulations, professional standards. So that's the first place you should go to gather facts about an issue situation in a work context. Those codes and value statements are there to help you discern right from wrong. They'll usually cover whatever legalities apply to you, but perhaps not. And so you may also have to seek legal counsel as well. And note that a lot of large organizations have internal legal counsel that you could speak with. If the issue or action is against a law or prohibited by profession or organizational standards, or organizational standards, then it's a wrong, a moral temptation, and you should refuse to engage in it. However, if the situation or issue passes the legal regulations test, don't assume it's ethical to do. Ask yourself, does the action or issue depart from the truth at all? Do the statements or actions that people are espousing or suggesting align with generally known facts or truths? Now, this is complex because it can get into issues of interpretation and intent. For example, which facts are generally known. But generally speaking, we do have a sense of whether something is truthful or not. If it passes the law, regulations, professional standards test, and it passes the truth test, you should also check it against the third test, which Kidder calls deviation from moral rectitude. You could also think about it as your own moral compass. And this is like going against the moral grain. It feels wrong, it's misaligned with a code of fundamental values. That might also help you know whether you are facing a wrong. And this is extremely important, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about last week from Bazerman and Ten Brunzel on why we fail to be ethically sensitive or see an ethical or moral issue when we're facing one. It's not usually because we are amoral, which is defined by Kidder as someone with no inner moral compass or no sense of shame or remorse, but because we are immoral. We fail to act or see in ways that our own moral compass or values would demand us to do. When we act immorally, we are engaging in things that, with hindsight or systems 2 thinking, we never would have engaged in. Now note that notions of wrong do change over time, but not because values change or because of ethical relativism, but because of our growing ability and intellect and experience to see certain acts as undermining core values. Also, because of growing consensus of prioritization of one core value over another. For example, smoking. It went from morally acceptable and even popular to morally reprehensible today. And the reason, primarily, is that society decided to prioritize health and safety over individual freedoms and liberties. So in America, we would say, we have no right to interfere with a person's decision. If they want to smoke, they should be able to smoke because that's individual freedom and liberty. But now we're saying, well, no, wait a second. One person's individual freedom and liberties to smoke impedes another individual's freedoms and liberties to not have to inhale secondhand smoke. And so society just kind of changed that, we think smoking is wrong because it endangers the health and safety of our people. Will be interesting to see how the invention of e-cigarettes changes this, if it does, right? Because now e-cigarettes just harm the user, there's no secondhand smoke from it. So it will be interesting to see if that changes at all the society's perception of smoking as wrong. So, to summarize, moral temptations are when you are facing a right versus wrong choice. These are not usually deep or complex. As Kidder says, the closer you get to them, the more they begin to smell. He calls this a stench test. For example, I might say, even though I know it's right to be honest, I'm going to cheat because I don't have time to do the assignment otherwise. It's a weak statement. It's a moral temptation trying to be recast as something else. And it's our immorality, our inability to act according to our own moral compass or to recognize an ethical issue that gives rise to moral temptations. Now be wary, because people can rationalize a wrong action by pretending it is a right one or justifying it for other reasons. For example, here's some moral temptations that people are trying to justify. I didn't have a choice. I had to park in that reserved parking spot. I paid for a permit and I have a right to be able to park on campus. Or, I knew my friend was cheating off of me during a test, but I didn't say anything because it's not right to be a tattletale. Or, my coworkers told me that everyone fudges their time cards in order to make up for breaks that the company is supposed to give us but doesn't. This is an ethical dilemma. Should I do it too? So all of these people are considering or doing a wrong and trying to justify it as a right or something they have no choice over. But really, they're all moral temptations. Now, ethics at work goes beyond the personal to the professional and the organizational. This doesn't mean that you're a different ethical person at work than you are in your personal life, but it does mean that you might have to make some decisions differently or even take different actions than you are normally comfortable with taking. It also means that you will likely experience more conflicts and ethical dilemmas at work than you do in your personal life, because more people have more of a say in what you say and do at work or in your profession. This is because it's not just your values or principles that are important, but those of your profession and organization. And these values and principles may not always or easily align with one another. Individual employees have to make ethical decisions and take ethical actions within the context of their work situation, again according to codes and other policies. Also, ethical decisions and actions can have different repercussions at work than in personal life. Losing your job or your career is much different than losing a friend or making someone angry at you because you've told them you're not going to do something. You can't just barrel through work-based problems on gut instincts because they must be guided by multiple policies, procedures, standards, and expectations. And the other complicated thing about personal ethics at work is ethics is tied to the economic and business systems. You can separate them from one another, but it's very difficult. And you always have to be conscious, as we talked about last week, about recasting an ethical issue as an economic or business one. But really, the issue of ethics at work is less about directly observable or obvious acts of misconduct and more about the lack of ethical thought or action in organizations. The Enron crisis, for example, was not necessarily caused by these 5 most frequently observed types of misconduct, but by a system that encouraged profits over ethics, diminished the importance of the means in favor of the ends, and convinced employees that they had to do what they were told, even if they felt inherently that it was wrong or unethical. And finally, a lot of misconduct at work happens because people do not say anything. This gets back to what the National Business Ethics Survey talks about, weak ethical cultures. Weak ethical cultures are formed by weak ethical individuals, people who do not know how to identify an ethical situation when they see one, or how to make an ethical decision, and then how to take ethical action, from the bottom of the company to the top. And in fact, in the NEBS 2013 survey, we saw that a lot of the misconduct is happening or being instigated by managers. In this class, we are focusing on the individual and how they can make better ethical decisions at work. Other classes at Rady, for example, Management 166, Business Ethics and Corporate Responsibility, focus more on what leaders need to do to create strong ethical cultures. So this is a good kind of prereq class for taking Management 166, and I recommend that you do take that one. Including what we learned in Unit 1, for example, ethical fading will lead people to do wrong at work, not only not recognize a moral issue, but then of course do wrong because they didn't recognize that moral issue. In addition to that, workers may be morally tempted to do a wrong because of pressure to break the rules. This occurs a lot, or we hear people say this a lot, both in school, the pressure to get that grade no matter what, or the pressure to meet those sales quotas. A lot of people do not know how to make good ethical decisions when they're under pressure. As I just mentioned, weak ethical cultures, which can lead to more misconduct, decreased confidence in top leaders, and decreased employee confidence in handling ethical situations. Weak ethical leadership, people at the top modeling ethical decision making and modeling what we talked about last week with Bazerman and Tenbunzel saying a good question always is, are there or what are the ethical dimensions to this situation? If employees don't see the leaders asking that question, they will likely also not ask that question. Reward systems that focus on ends, not means, and as a result, people develop a whatever it takes attitude, and they're extrinsically motivated. And as we learned about last week, values and our ethical values are intrinsic. And so if people are extrinsically motivated, social science research has found that they are more likely to engage in ethical misconduct. And finally, as I hinted at earlier, compliance systems can actually cause misconduct because they encourage a cost-benefit analysis. So people, again, aren't motivated internally about doing what is ethical or right, but they are motivated externally based on the costs of not doing what is right or the benefits of doing something wrong. Compliance systems can also cause ethical fading. If I have something that tells me what is wrong and what is right, then I will stop asking to look at the ethical dimensions of every situation because I figure somebody will tell me to comply. And as I mentioned, sometimes people rebel. So I don't know if you heard about the University of North Carolina case of misconduct by a department chair who changed students' grades and gave students for essentially no classwork grades, and a lot of the students were athletes. This went on for a decade without anyone saying anything, but it's highly unlikely that others did not know of the behavior. So why didn't anyone say anything? It could be that they feared retaliation by the department chair, as the MBES 2013 report talks about retaliation, or it could be that they felt their own pressure to allow the breaking of rules to happen. It could be they failed to see the ethical dimensions of the issue. They were focused on the rewards for having a quote-unquote great football team, or any number of other reasons we looked at last week and we will continue to look at this quarter. But regardless, this has resulted in damaged reputation for UNC, an implementation of a whole new system of rules and regulations, and a diminishing of the integrity of the degrees that all students received during that time. That is, people will have doubt about all UNC degrees, not just those involved in this situation, because we actually don't know the names of all the students involved in this situation. So ensure that you do thoroughly read that MBES report to understand misconduct at work. And one more thing about compliance systems. This is different than codes of ethics. So what Bazerman and Tenbunzel are talking about are things that just say don't do any of these behaviors, comply or else. Whereas codes of ethics are trying to just codify the internalized values that we already have. And so there is a difference between them. So in summary, in this class we are focused on personal ethics at work, not corporate or leadership ethics, which is just as interesting, but it's not the topic for this class. We're going to be less focused on bad behavior and more on making good ethical decisions and acting ethically. So already we've gone over 4 steps to good ethical decision making. Step 1, we enhance our ethical sensitivity so we can recognize, identify moral or ethical issues. Step 2, we establish if we are the responsible actor. Am I the person responsible for doing something? And And we can say yes if we've seen something happen or we have the ability to stop something from happening. Step 3, we have to gather relevant facts in a workplace or a professional situation. That's checking the codes of ethics for your organization and your profession, first of all. And step 4, that will help you identify if you're tempted to do wrong, but also, of course, asking yourself, are we deviating from the truth at all? Or are we deviating from our moral compass? In this class, work is the context, but it's not necessarily the focus. Ethical decision-making is the focus. And that is it for Unit 2.